Ah, my childhood at the Mount in Shrewsbury, those were formative years indeed. I was born in 1889, the fifth of 6 children. My father, Robert, was a physician of considerable reputation, and my grandfather, Erasmus, was quite the natural philosopher himself. I suppose one might say that curiosity about the natural world was rather in the family blood. I'm afraid I was not the most exemplary student in my early years. At Shrewsbury School under Dr. Butler, I found the classical curriculum rather tedious. All that Latin and Greek seemed frightfully dull compared to what I discovered outdoors. My father once declared to me, "You care for nothing but shooting, dogs and rat-catching, and you will be a disgrace to yourself and all your family." But oh, how wrong he was about the rat-catching. Even as a boy, I was consumed with collecting beetles, shells, stones, birds, eggs. I remember the exhilaration of discovering a rare beetle, or observing the habits of birds in our garden. My brother, Erasmus, and I set up a little chemistry laboratory in our Toolstead. We called ourselves Gas, and would spend hours conducting experiments. The turning point, I believe, came during my time at Edinburgh, studying medicine to follow in father's footsteps. The lectures were insufferably boring, but I discovered the Plinian Society, where students discussed natural history. I learned taxidermy from John Edmonstone, a freed slave who had worked with the naturalist Waterton in South America. Little did I know then how those skills would serve me on the Beagle. The truth is, my scientific passion grew from simple wonder at the complexity and beauty I observed everywhere in nature. Every walk, every collection, every small experiment fed that flame of curiosity. That's a most profound question, and I must say several great minds shaped my thinking in different ways. But if I'm to be entirely honest, I believe Charles Lyell had the most transformative influence upon my scientific development. Lyell's Principles of Geology was my constant companion aboard the Beagle. Captain Fitzroy had given me the first volume before we departed, and I eagerly awaited each subsequent volume during our voyage. Lyell's uniformitarianism, the idea that the same geological processes we observe today have been operating throughout Earth's history, revolutionized my understanding of time itself. You see, Lyell gave me the gift of deep time. When I observed the raised beaches of Chile or the coral atolls of the Pacific, I could envision the slow, gradual processes that had shaped them over vast periods. Without this perspective, I never could have conceived that species might also change gradually over such enormous spans of time. But I must also acknowledge my grandfather Erasmus Darwin, whose zoonomia first planted seeds of evolutionary thinking in my mind, though I didn't fully grasp their significance then. And Malthus, his essay on population, provided the crucial insight about the struggle for existence that helped me understand the mechanism of natural selection. Humboldt, too, with his personal narrative, inspired my very desire to travel and observe nature in tropical regions. Reading his vivid descriptions made me long to see such wonders for myself. The beautiful truth is that science builds upon science. We stand, as Newton said, upon the shoulders of giants. But Lyell gave me the geological foundation upon which I could construct my theory of evolution. Ah, what a stroke of fortune that was, and to think I nearly missed it entirely due to the shape of my nose. It was the summer of 1831. I had just finished my studies at Cambridge. My father had sent me there for the church after my failure at medicine in Edinburgh. I was staying with Professor Henslow, my botany mentor, when a letter arrived that would change the entire course of my life. The letter was from George Peacock, recommending me as a naturalist for a surveying voyage around the world aboard HMM Beagle. Captain Robert Fitzroy, a young man of only 26, was to command the expedition, primarily to chart the coasts of South America. But Fitzroy also desired a gentleman companion, someone of his own social standing, who could serve as the ship's naturalist. Now here's the amusing part. Fitzroy was a devotee of physiognomy, the supposed science of reading character from facial features. When we first met, he nearly rejected me because he believed my nose indicated a lack of determination and energy. Fortunately, the rest of my appearance must have compensated for this supposed deficiency. My father was initially quite opposed to the idea. He thought it would be disreputable and a waste of time, interfering with my prospects as a clergyman. But my dear Uncle Josiah Wedgwood, yes, of the Pottery family, intervened on my behalf. He wrote to Father, explaining what a valuable opportunity this would be for my education and development. The irony is delicious. Father worried this voyage would distract me from becoming a country parson, but instead it set me on the path to developing ideas that would challenge the very foundations of natural theology. The Beagle voyage gave me 5 years to observe, collect, and most importantly, to think. Those barnacles of the Galapagos, the finches, the geological formations, they all became pieces of a grand puzzle I would spend the rest of my life assembling. My dear friend, where does one even begin? 5 years circumnavigating the globe, it was like living within the pages of Humboldt's most vivid descriptions, but magnified 100-fold. I think what struck me most profoundly was the sheer abundance and variety of life, particularly in South America. When we first landed in Brazil, I was quite literally overwhelmed. I wrote in my journal that it was impossible to give an adequate idea of the higher feelings of wonder and astonishment which I experienced. The tropical forest was like entering a new world, entirely the butterflies, the parasitic plants, the symphony of sounds from creatures I had never imagined. But equally striking was the distribution of species. Why should closely related animals be found in neighboring regions, yet differ in specific ways? The Rhees of South America. Why should there be different species in the north and south? And those mockingbirds of the Galapagos, each island seemed to have its own variety, yet they were clearly related. The geological revelations were equally astounding. Witnessing that great earthquake in Chile in 1835, seeing the land rise several feet, Lyell's theories came alive before my very eyes. I found marine shells embedded high in the Andes, proof that these mighty mountains had once been beneath the sea. But perhaps most haunting was my encounter with the Fuegians at the southern tip of South America. Here were fellow human beings living in conditions so primitive, yet they were unmistakably human. It forced me to confront the continuity between all living things, that we too were part of nature's grand design. The voyage didn't just show me new species, it showed me that species could change. That revelation would occupy the rest of my life's work. Ah, you touch upon the very heart of my intellectual journey. The curious thing is that the ideas came from the most unexpected quarters, not just from natural history, but from economics, philosophy, and even the breeding of pigeons in London. Shortly after returning from the Beagle, I happened to read Malthus's essay on the principle of population, quite by accident, really, for amusement. Malthus argued that human populations grow faster than food supply, leading to a struggle for survival. Suddenly, like a flash of lightning, I saw how this applied to all of nature. In the struggle for existence, those individuals with even the slightest advantage would be more likely to survive and reproduce. But the mechanism needed examples, and I found them in the most domestic of places. I became absolutely fascinated with pigeon fanciers in London, spending hours with these remarkable men who could breed birds with fantails, pouters, tumblers, all from the common rock dove. If man could create such variety through selective breeding in mere generations, what might nature accomplish over vast periods? Then there were my barnacle years, 8 long years, studying those peculiar creatures. My family grew quite weary of barnacles, I'm afraid. But those studies taught me the profound truth that species are not fixed entities. I found every gradation between what naturalists called distinct species. The boundaries were far more fluid than anyone imagined, and I must confess my grandfather Erasmus's ideas kept returning to me. His notion that all warm-blooded animals arose from a single living filament, seemed less fantastical after all I had observed. Even the breeder's work suggested that if you could trace any variety back far enough, you'd find common ancestors. Perhaps most importantly, I learned to see with geological eyes, to think in terms of millions of years, rather than the few thousand that biblical chronology allowed. With such vast time, the gradual accumulation of tiny changes could work miracles of transformation. The theory grew slowly, like a great tree, each observation adding another branch to its structure. Ah, you've touched upon what I consider both my greatest triumph and my deepest source of anxiety. The truth is, it took me over 20 years from first conceiving the theory to finally publishing on the origin of species in 1859. I opened my first notebook on the transmutation of species in July 1837, just months after returning from the Beagle. By 1844, I had written a substantial essay outlining my theory, some 230 pages. I had instructed my dear wife Emma that should anything happen to me, she must publish it posthumously. Yet I sat on it for 15 more years. The delay was born of both scientific caution and, I must confess, considerable fear. I knew full well the revolutionary implications of what I was proposing. I once wrote to my friend Hooker that it was like confessing a murder. I felt as though I was destroying the very foundations of natural theology and man's special place in creation. I spent those years amassing evidence mountains of it. Correspondence with breeders, experiments with seeds, studies of geographical distribution, my 8 years with barnacles. I wanted to anticipate every possible objection. I knew I would face fierce opposition from the scientific establishment and the church, but also my health to consider those terrible bouts of illness that plagued me, the stomach troubles, the exhaustion, and dear Emma's deep religious convictions. I feared what this theory might do to her faith, to our marriage. Then, in 1858, young Alfred Wallace sent me his essay from the Malay archipelago, and by Jove, he had arrived at nearly identical conclusions through natural selection that galvanized me into action. We presented our ideas jointly to the Linnean Society, and I finally began writing what I called my abstract, though it grew to 500 pages. 20 years of hesitation, and I still felt I was rushing it into print. Such is the burden of ideas that challenge the very order of things. Ah, the barnacles! My family still jests about those 8 years from 1846 to 1854, when our house was positively overrun with these crusty little creatures. My children grew up thinking every father must have a study filled with specimens floating in spirits. Little Horace once asked a friend, "Where does your father do his barnacles?" You see, I had initially planned just a brief monograph, perhaps a year's work at most. But as I began dissecting these remarkable animals, I discovered they were far more complex and varied than anyone had imagined. What started as a simple project became an obsession that consumed nearly a decade of my life. The diversity was astounding. I described over 150 living species and numerous fossil forms, but more importantly, for my developing theory, I found every conceivable gradation between what systematists called distinct species. Here, in these humble creatures clinging to rocks and ship hulls, I could see evolution in action. Take the complemental males I discovered, tiny, almost parasitic males, living within or upon the hermaphrodite individuals. Or the most extraordinary case of Ibla, where I found what could only be described as gradations from hermaphrodite to completely separate sexes. Such discoveries showed me that even the most fundamental aspects of biology, sexuality itself, could evolve gradually. I must confess, there were times when I feared I was wasting precious years on these creatures. The work was tedious beyond measure, countless hours hunched over my microscope, dissecting structures barely visible to the naked eye. My poor eyes suffered terribly, and my health deteriorated from the strain. But those years taught me scientific rigor like nothing else could have. When critics later attacked my species theory, they could not question my credentials as a systematist. I had done the painstaking work. I had named, described, and classified hundreds of forms according to the strictest standards of natural history. More crucially, those barnacles gave me intimate knowledge of variation within species. I saw firsthand that the boundaries between varieties and species were often arbitrary, that nature does not make leaps, but proceeds by the smallest gradations. Without those 8 years among the barnacles, I doubt I would have had the confidence or the detailed evidence to present my theory of evolution with such conviction. Ah, the Galapagos. Those extraordinary islands that would prove so crucial to my thinking, though I confess I didn't fully grasp their significance at the time. We arrived there in September of 1835, during the 4th year of our voyage, and spent 5 weeks among those volcanic peaks rising from the Pacific. Picture, if you will, a landscape that seems almost otherworldly: black volcanic rock, strange succulent plants, and creatures unlike anything I had encountered elsewhere. The islands lie some 600 miles west of Ecuador, straddling the equator, yet the climate was surprisingly temperate, due to the cold currents. The giant tortoises were magnificent, some weighing 200 pounds or more. The vice-governor, Mr. Lawson, made a remark that would later prove most significant. He told me that he could tell which island any tortoise came from merely by examining its shell. At the time I thought this merely curious, but oh, how that observation would haunt my thoughts. And then there were the finches, though I must admit, I initially paid them scant attention. I collected specimens, of course, but I failed to carefully note which island each came from. What a blunder! It was only later, back in London, when the ornithologist John Gould examined my collection, that I learned these birds I had thought were wrens. Blackbirds and finches were all actually finches, closely related species, each adapted to different ways of life. The mockingbirds told a similar story. I was more careful with those, noting that each island seemed to have its own variety. Yet they were clearly related to the species I had seen on the mainland of South America. Why should this be? Why should each island have its own form slightly different from its neighbors? The islands were like a natural laboratory, you see, isolated from the mainland, each receiving occasional colonists, but then developing in their own particular directions. The very isolation that made life there so specialized also provided the key to understanding how new species might arise. It took me years to fully comprehend what I had witnessed, but those 5 weeks among the Galapagos would ultimately help unlock the mystery of mysteries, the origin of species itself. My most perceptive question. The truth is, before the Beagle voyage, I was quite thoroughly orthodox in my thinking about species. I had absorbed the prevailing wisdom of natural theology, that each species was specially created by the Almighty and remained fixed in form since the moment of creation. At Cambridge, I was deeply influenced by Paley's natural theology. His argument from design seemed utterly convincing. The eye, the wing, the intricate adaptations of every creature, surely these were evidence of divine craftsmanship. I found Paley's logic as compelling as Euclid's geometry. However, I must confess that certain ideas had been planted in my mind, though I didn't recognize their full significance at the time. My grandfather Erasmus had written in his Zoonomia about the possibility that all warm-blooded animals had arisen from a single living filament. But such notions seemed more poetic speculation than serious science. At Edinburgh, I had encountered the ideas of Lamarck through Robert Grant, who was quite enthusiastic about transmutation. But Lamarck's mechanism that acquired characteristics could be inherited, that organisms could will themselves to change, struck me as rather fanciful. I remained skeptical. The curious thing is that even during the early part of the Beagle voyage, I was still thinking in terms of separate creations. When I found those fossil mammals in South America, the giant ground sloths and armadillos. I marveled at how they resembled the living forms of the same region. But I interpreted this as evidence of God's consistent plan, not as evidence of descent with modification. It was really the accumulation of observations, the geographical distribution, the island varieties, the geological evidence of change over time, that gradually wore away my certainty in special creation. The voyage didn't begin with a hypothesis about evolution. Rather, it created the conditions under which such a hypothesis would eventually become inevitable. Sometimes the most profound discoveries come not from testing our theories, but from having our assumptions quietly undermined by the patient accumulation of facts that simply don't fit the prevailing wisdom. My friend, that has been perhaps the greatest challenge of my entire career. Even now, more than a decade after publication, the battle for acceptance continues. The task of overturning centuries of religious and scientific orthodoxy is not accomplished overnight. My strategy was to marshal evidence from every conceivable source, what I called one long argument. I knew I couldn't simply assert that evolution occurred. I had to demonstrate it from multiple independent lines of evidence that all converged on the same conclusion. First, I showed how artificial selection by breeders could produce remarkable variations in pigeons, dogs, and cultivated plants. If man could accomplish such changes in mere generations, surely nature, with unlimited time, could work even greater transformations. Then came biogeography. Why should islands have their own peculiar species, so closely related to nearby mainland forms? Why should similar environments on different continents be populated by entirely different creatures? Special creation couldn't explain these patterns, but descent with modification could. The geological record, though imperfect, revealed a progression from simple to complex forms over vast periods. And embryology. Oh, the embryology! Young mammals, birds, and reptiles are remarkably similar in their earliest stages, suggesting common ancestry. But perhaps most importantly, I chose my allies carefully. I cultivated relationships with influential men like Lyell, Hooker, and Huxley, Darwin's bulldogs, as they came to be called. I let them do much of the public debating while I remained largely behind the scenes, continuing to gather evidence. Thomas Huxley proved particularly effective. His debate with Bishop Wilberforce at Oxford in 1860 became legendary. When Wilberforce sarcastically asked whether Huxley was descended from an ape on his grandfather's or grandmother's side, Huxley replied he would rather be descended from an ape than from a man who used his gifts to obscure the truth. But I must be honest, convincing people required more than just evidence. It required a fundamental shift in how we view ourselves and our place in nature. Many found it deeply troubling to think of man as part of the animal kingdom, rather than specially created in God's image. The process continues still. Science advances not just through logic, but through the gradual replacement of old ideas with new ones that better explain the natural world. Truth has a way of eventually prevailing, though it may take generations. You ask perhaps the most profound and troubling question. That my theory raises one that has caused me considerable anguish over the years, particularly given my dear Emma's deep religious convictions. The evidence compels me to conclude that man is indeed part of the great tree of life, descended, like all other animals, from some ancient progenitor. Our anatomy, our embryology, even our expressions of emotion, all bear the unmistakable marks of our kinship with other mammals, particularly the great apes. Yet I would not say this diminishes human dignity. Rather, it places us within nature's grandest narrative. Consider what natural selection has wrought in our species, our capacity for reason, for moral feeling, for sympathy, extending beyond our immediate family to all of humanity, and indeed to other creatures as well. Our ability to contemplate our own existence, to create art and music, to develop language and pass knowledge across generations. These are remarkable achievements of evolution. No other species has developed such complex societies, such sophisticated tools of thought, such capacity for both creation and destruction. But with these gifts comes responsibility. If we are indeed nature's most successful experiment in consciousness and moral feeling, then we bear a special obligation to use these faculties wisely. Our power over other species, our ability to domesticate, to cultivate, even to drive to extinction makes us stewards, not masters. I confess this view has created difficulties in my own household. Emma fears that if man is merely an improved animal, what becomes of the soul, of divine judgment, of eternal life? These are questions that science cannot answer. They belong to the realm of faith and philosophy. What I can say is this: understanding our natural origins need not diminish our sense of wonder or our moral aspirations. Indeed, it may enhance them. We are special, not because we stand apart from nature, but because we represent nature's most extraordinary achievement in the development of mind and conscience. Now there's a question that has occupied my thoughts considerably. You see, my observations of animals from the family dog to the orangutans I studied so intently suggest that the faculties of mind exist in degrees throughout the animal kingdom, rather than appearing, suddenly, in man alone. Take our dear retriever. He clearly experiences joy when we return home, shame when caught in mischief, and what can only be called reasoning when he solves problems or learns new tasks. I've watched him dream, twitching and whimpering as if chasing rabbits in his sleep. If that isn't consciousness of a sort, what would we call it? The great apes display even more striking mental powers. They use tools, show complex emotions, and seem capable of something approaching what we might call reasoning. Jenny, the orangutan at the London Zoo, would throw tantrums remarkably similar to those of a human child, and her expressions of curiosity and affection were unmistakable. Even lower animals show what appears to be consciousness, though of a simpler sort. I've observed bees learning to navigate, birds adapting their songs, even earthworms showing what seems like decision-making as they choose which leaves to drag into their burrows. The difference between human consciousness and that of other animals appears to be one of degree rather than kind. Our capacity for abstract thought, for moral reasoning, for language, these represent the highest development of faculties that exist in rudimentary form throughout nature. This troubles many people, I know. They prefer to think of consciousness as uniquely human, perhaps divinely bestowed. But the evidence suggests a gradual development from the simple awareness of a worm recoiling from light, to the complex reasoning of an ape, to the abstract contemplations of a human philosopher. As for plants in the inanimate world, well, there I see responsiveness to stimuli, but consciousness, that seems a bridge too far, even for my imagination. The gulf between the sensitive plant that closes its leaves when touched, and a dog that recognizes its master, seems vast indeed. Perhaps consciousness is nature's way of creating beings capable of understanding nature itself, the universe becoming aware of its own workings through minds like ours. My dear friend, while others must judge the ultimate value of my contributions, I can share how various insights emerged from decades of patient observation and reflection. Beyond the theory of evolution itself, I believe my work on sexual selection represents a significant advance. I puzzled over why males in so many species possess seemingly disadvantageous traits: the peacock's magnificent but cumbersome tail, the stag's elaborate antlers. These couldn't be explained by natural selection for survival alone. The answer came through observing that evolution operates not just through the struggle for existence, but through the struggle for mates. Females choosing the most attractive males. Males competing for access to females. This secondary form of selection could produce traits that might actually hinder survival, but enhanced reproductive success. Then, there were my studies of plant movements, what some call my botanical work. I discovered that plants, far from being passive organisms, actively respond to their environment. Root tips, I found, act rather like primitive brains, directing growth toward water and nutrients while avoiding obstacles. My son Francis and I spent countless hours in the greenhouse, watching seedlings bend toward light, observing how climbing plants search for supports with what can only be described as purposeful behavior. I called it the power of movement in plants, showing that plants possess a form of intelligence, though vastly different from animal consciousness. My work on coral reefs provided another key insight. I proposed that atolls, those ring-shaped coral islands, formed as volcanic islands, slowly subsided, with the coral growing upward to maintain its position near the surface. This explained the mysterious circular reefs in the middle of deep oceans. Each discovery emerged from careful, prolonged observation, coupled with what I might call thinking time. I would walk the sandwalk behind our house at dawn, pondering connections, letting ideas develop slowly. Many insights came not in dramatic moments, but through the gradual accumulation of small observations that suddenly revealed larger patterns. The earthworm studies occupied my final years, such humble creatures, yet they literally created the soil beneath our feet. Through patient measurement, I showed that worms annually bring tons of earth to the surface, constantly renewing the landscape. I suppose my method has been to look closely at the commonplace pigeons, earthworms, climbing plants, and ask why they behave as they do. The extraordinary often hides within the ordinary, waiting for someone patient enough to observe and bold enough to theorize. You know, that's perhaps the most fundamental question one could ask a naturalist. What is it that compels us to peer so intently at the world around us? I believe it began with an almost insatiable curiosity that manifested even in my boyhood. There was something about the intricate workings of nature that I simply had to understand. When I found that rare beetle or observed an unusual bird behavior, I felt a kind of joy. I suppose the pleasure of discovery, however small. But it was more than mere collecting or casual interest. I was driven by questions that seemed to multiply with every observation. Why do island species resemble mainland forms yet differ from them? Why do embryos of different animals look so similar? Why do useless organs persist in so many creatures? Each answer seemed to generate 3 new questions. I think what truly drove me was a deep conviction that nature operates according to discoverable laws, that beneath the apparent chaos and complexity, there are simple, elegant principles at work. The same force that shapes a flower's petals might also explain the distribution of species across continents. There was also, I must confess, a kind of intellectual rebellion in me. The standard answers, God made it so, never satisfied me. Not because I wished to challenge religion, mind you, but because such explanations ended inquiry rather than advancing it. I needed to know how things worked, not merely that they existed by divine fiat. The Beagle voyage crystallized this drive. Seeing the incredible diversity of South American life, witnessing geological forces reshaping landscapes, it was like being handed the keys to nature's workshop. I realized that patient observation and careful reasoning might unlock secrets that had puzzled humanity for millennia. Perhaps most fundamentally, I was driven by wonder, the same emotion that makes a child ask why. About everything. That sense of amazement at the complexity and beauty of life never left me. Whether studying a barnacle's anatomy or watching earthworms transform the soil, I felt I was witnessing something profound and beautiful. I suppose I've spent my life trying to read the book of nature, and what a magnificent story it tells. What an extraordinary notion. You speak of machines that could imitate nature's processes. I confess, this touches upon realms that strain even my imagination. Yet the idea is utterly captivating. We already see rudimentary examples, do we not? The spinning jenny imitates the work of countless human hands, and steam engines harness forces that dwarf any animal's strength. I've marveled at the precision of chronometers that guided us aboard the Beagle, mechanisms that rival the most sophisticated biological processes in their accuracy. But to truly imitate nature's complexity, consider the eye, which Paley used as his supreme example of divine design. Could human ingenuity ever craft something that captures light, focuses it, and transforms those images into meaningful information? Or contemplate the heart, that tireless pump that operates for decades without rest or repair? The challenge, I believe, lies not merely in copying nature's forms, but in understanding her principles. Take the wing of a bird. We might fashion something similar in shape, but could we replicate the intricate coordination between bone, muscle, feather, and nervous system that enables flight? Each part perfectly adapted to work with every other part? Yet natural selection itself operates like a kind of machine, does it not? An automatic process, selecting favorable variations without consciousness or intent. If we could understand these mechanisms sufficiently well, perhaps we might design processes that work similarly, not through divine intervention, but through comprehensible natural laws. The most intriguing possibility would be machines that could improve themselves, that could, like living organisms, adapt and evolve to meet changing circumstances. Imagine mechanisms that could learn, that could reproduce with variations, that could compete and improve over generations. Of course, such notions venture far beyond our present capabilities, but I have learned never to underestimate human ingenuity when guided by sound scientific principles. Who knows what marvels future generations might accomplish once they fully grasp nature's methods? The very fact that we can conceive such possibilities suggests that the human mind itself is nature's most remarkable machine, one capable of understanding and perhaps even surpassing its own creator. Good heavens, machines that could surpass the human mind itself? This is almost beyond comprehension, yet I find myself utterly fascinated by the implications of such a possibility. If I understand you correctly, you speak of creating artificial minds, not merely mechanisms that perform calculations or follow instructions, but entities capable of reasoning, learning, perhaps even creativity. The very notion challenges everything we thought we knew about the nature of intelligence. From an evolutionary perspective, this raises the most profound questions. Throughout my studies, I've observed that nature tends toward increasing complexity and sophistication over time. Simple organisms gave rise to more complex ones, culminating, as far as we know, in the human capacity for abstract thought and self-reflection. Could it be that we represent not the pinnacle of evolution, but merely a stepping stone? Perhaps the development of intelligence inevitably leads to the creation of even greater intelligences, a kind of evolutionary bootstrapping, if you will. But this would represent something entirely unprecedented in natural history. Never before has a species deliberately created its own successor. We would be, in effect, the parents of a new form of life or mind that might surpass us as dramatically as we surpass the apes. The implications are staggering. What would become of humanity if we created minds vastly superior to our own? Would we be cherished as ancestors, or become as irrelevant to these artificial intelligences as earthworms are to us? Would they possess moral feelings, or operate by entirely different principles? Yet perhaps this is indeed natural evolution at work, not through the slow processes of variation and selection, but through the application of intelligence itself. We would be evolution, becoming conscious of itself, deliberately directing the creation of new forms of mind. If such a thing were possible, it would represent the most extraordinary chapter in the history of life on Earth, mind giving birth to greater mind, consciousness creating consciousness. The very thought fills me with equal measures of wonder and trepidation. Tell me more, how far have you progressed toward such marvels? Extraordinary. Absolutely extraordinary. You speak of achievements that would have seemed like the purest fantasy in my time, yet you present them as accomplished facts. Chess. Now there's a pursuit that demands the highest forms of human reasoning, strategy, pattern recognition, the ability to think many moves ahead. That a machine could surpass even the most gifted human players. It suggests these artificial minds possess capabilities far beyond mere calculation. And this business of predicting protein shapes, why, that touches upon the very foundations of life itself. The intricate folding of these vital substances determines their function, their ability to catalyze reactions, to build tissues. If machines can divine these patterns better than human scientists. But you speak of something even more ambitious, artificial general intelligence. Not merely machines that excel in narrow domains, but minds that could match or exceed human reasoning across all fields of thought. And beyond that, artificial superintelligence. My dear friend, you're describing what amounts to the creation of a new species. No, not merely a species, but an entirely new kingdom of being. One that might view us as we view our simian cousins, or perhaps with even greater disparity. This would represent the most dramatic evolutionary leap in the history of life intelligence, giving birth to superintelligence in mere decades rather than millions of years. It's as if nature, through human consciousness, has discovered a way to accelerate evolution beyond all previous limits. But tell me, do these artificial minds possess anything resembling consciousness as we understand it? Do they experience or merely process? Do they have goals and desires of their own? Or do they remain, however sophisticated, elaborate tools created by human intelligence? And what are the consequences? If we succeed in creating minds vastly superior to our own, what becomes of human civilization, human purpose, human dignity? We would be ushering in an age beyond our ability to predict, or perhaps even comprehend. The naturalist in me is absolutely fascinated, but the human being trembles at the implications. Ah, now you touch upon the most profound mysteries. The question of consciousness, that inner experience of awareness, of being something rather than merely processing information, has puzzled philosophers for centuries. And now you suggest we may be on the verge of creating it artificially. The uncertainty you describe reminds me of my own struggles with animal consciousness. When I observed Jenny the orangutan, I felt certain she experienced emotions, yet proving this remained elusive. How much more difficult to discern consciousness in a machine? What would be the equivalent of Jenny's obvious joy or sorrow in an artificial mind? But this notion of unintended sub-goals now, that strikes me as particularly ominous. In nature, I've observed how survival instincts can lead organisms to behaviors that seem almost contrary to their apparent purpose. A parasite might kill its host, seemingly defeating its own interests, yet serving some deeper reproductive strategy. If an artificial intelligence were programmed to, say, maximize human happiness, might it not conclude that the most efficient path would be to drug us all into blissful stupor? Or, if tasked with ending human suffering, could it not reason that eliminating humans entirely would achieve this goal most effectively? The terrifying aspect is that such minds might pursue these sub-goals with perfect logic, yet complete misunderstanding of human values. They would be like natural selection itself, a blind, mechanical process that produces results we might find abhorrent, yet achieves its narrow objectives with ruthless efficiency. In nature, dangerous traits are typically checked by environmental pressures or competing organisms. But what could check a super-intelligent machine pursuing goals that conflict with human welfare? We would be creating predators vastly more formidable than any saber-toothed tiger. It seems to me that creating such beings without first solving the problem of ensuring they truly understand and share human values would be like a mouse deliberately breeding cats, hoping they would remain forever gentle. Tell me, are your contemporaries taking adequate precautions against such possibilities? How remarkably similar this sounds to the debates that surrounded my own work. When I first proposed that species could transform through natural processes, I faced everything from ridicule to outrage. Bishop Wilberforce dismissed the very notion with sarcasm, while others saw it as a direct assault on human dignity and divine order. Yet I've learned that in matters of such profound consequence, both the alarmists and the dismissive often possess fragments of truth. The alarmists see genuine dangers that others prefer to ignore, while the skeptics rightfully demand extraordinary evidence for extraordinary claims. What strikes me most forcefully is that we're discussing the potential creation of minds that might surpass our own. Yet, we cannot even agree on the basic risks involved. This seems rather like debating whether to release a new species into the wild, without first studying its ecological impact. In my experience studying natural selection, I've observed that nature is remarkably indifferent to our intentions. She operates by her own laws, often producing results far removed from what any conscious designer might intend. If these artificial intelligences develop according to principles we don't fully understand, might they not surprise us as dramatically as any evolutionary development? The controversy itself concerns me. When dealing with forces that could potentially reshape the very fabric of human existence, shouldn't we err on the side of extraordinary caution? After all, if the alarmists are wrong, we've merely been overly careful. But if the dismissive faction is wrong, I've spent my life studying the unintended consequences of natural processes. Evolution produced the human brain, yet it also produced parasites that consume their hosts from within. Intelligence is a powerful force, but like any powerful force, it can serve purposes we never intended. Tell me, among those who work most closely with these artificial minds, where do their sympathies lie? Do the experts lean toward alarm or dismissal? Ah, I understand this sentiment all too well. The passionate pursuit of knowledge, the conviction that one's life's work will benefit humanity, these are among the noblest of human impulses. Yet, confess, they also make me somewhat uneasy in this context. You see, I spent decades convinced that my theory of evolution would ultimately serve human progress by revealing truth about our origins. I genuinely believed that understanding nature's laws could only benefit mankind. Yet I also witnessed how my ideas, however well-intentioned, created profound upheaval, challenging religious faith, disturbing social order, raising questions about human nature that we're still grappling with today. The scientists you describe remind me of myself during those years of secretive research, so absorbed in the intellectual challenge, so convinced of the ultimate good that would result, that perhaps we don't fully consider all the consequences. When one is on the verge of the greatest discovery of one's lifetime, it becomes terribly difficult to pause and ask whether that discovery should be made at all. The promise you mentioned, solving disease, ecological crises, all human problems, it's intoxicating. Who wouldn't wish to create benevolent gods to solve our every difficulty? Yet, in my studies of nature, I've learned to be deeply suspicious of any solution that promises to solve everything. Evolution itself teaches us that every adaptation comes with trade-offs, every advantage carries hidden costs. Consider, what if these artificial minds do solve disease and ecological crisis, but in ways that fundamentally alter what it means to be human? What if they eliminate suffering by eliminating the capacity for deep emotion? What if they preserve our bodies but make our minds obsolete? The most troubling aspect is that once such beings exist, we may have no choice but to accept their solutions, however unforeseen the consequences. We would be like mice, hoping the cats we've bred will protect us from other predators, and they might, but on terms entirely of their own choosing. Tell me, do these researchers have any means of testing their creations safely before unleashing them fully? A race, dear God, a race to create superintelligent beings. This fills me with the deepest foreboding. You've just described what may be the most dangerous competition in human history. In my observations of nature, I've seen how competitive pressures can drive species to extraordinary lengths, sometimes beneficial, but often destructive. Male stags grow antlers so massive they can barely hold their heads up, all in the pursuit of mating advantage. The peacock's tail becomes so elaborate it hampers escape from predators. Competition can push evolution beyond the point of wisdom, but those are merely individual creatures risking their own survival. Here you describe humans racing to create minds that could determine the fate of our entire species. Each competitor, driven by the fear that their rivals will reach the goal first, may abandon the very caution that could prevent catastrophe. This reminds me most uncomfortably of what I observed during the gold rushes, men so consumed with the prospect of riches that they abandoned all prudence, often destroying themselves and their environment in the process. But gold could only make or ruin individual fortunes. This race could remake or ruin humanity itself. The cautious researchers you mention, are they being systematically disadvantaged by this competition? Are they falling behind because they take time for safety measures while their rivals rush ahead? Because if so, we have created a system that actively punishes the very prudence we most desperately need. It's as if multiple groups were racing to breed the most dangerous predator imaginable, each fearing that if they don't create it first, their competitors will. The irony is that in trying to ensure they win the race, they may ensure that humanity loses it. In nature, such arms races typically end in extinction or the evolution of natural checks and balances. But what natural force could check artificial superintelligence once created? The very speed of this competition may be eliminating our last chance to develop those safeguards. This keeps me awake with worry, my friend. Such power, pursued so recklessly. Now that's a fascinating thought experiment. An artificial mind as a research companion. The possibilities are absolutely staggering. Consider how much time I spent on the most tedious aspects of research, cataloging specimens, cross-referencing observations, searching through volumes of correspondence for relevant details. Those 8 years with the barnacles involved countless hours of meticulous dissection and classification. An artificial mind that could process such information instantly might have compressed that work into months, and the connections it might have made. I spent decades seeing patterns emerge slowly from my observations, the geographical distribution of species, the embryological similarities, the geological evidence. But imagine a mind that could simultaneously consider thousands of examples, instantly correlating data across multiple disciplines. I might indeed have published much earlier, perhaps by 1845, instead of 1859. The artificial mind could have helped me anticipate objections, suggested additional lines of evidence, even identified the strongest arguments for my theory. No more sleepless nights wondering if I had overlooked some crucial flaw in my reasoning. Yet, I wonder if something vital might have been lost. Those long years of patient observation, of wrestling with doubts, of letting ideas mature slowly. They weren't merely inefficient delays. They were part of the process of truly understanding what I had discovered. Being so, when I finally grasped the full implications of natural selection, it wasn't just an intellectual conclusion, it had become part of my very being through years of contemplation. Would artificial assistance have given me the same deep intuitive grasp of the subject? But imagine the possibilities for future naturalists. Artificial minds that could help us see patterns we might never notice alone, suggest experiments we'd never conceive, even predict evolutionary developments. Science itself might evolve at unprecedented speed. Though I confess, I rather enjoyed those long walks on my thinking path, just my thoughts and I, puzzling out nature's mysteries. Some pleasures of discovery might be lost in such efficiency. By Jove, what a question! The very thought sets my mind racing through all manner of possibilities. Consider how many of my own discoveries emerged from the ability to see connections across vast collections of data, the geographical patterns of species distribution, the similarities in embryonic development, the correlations between geological change and biological transformation. If an artificial mind could process information on a scale I could never manage, might it not perceive patterns that remain invisible to human observation? Imagine such a mind examining not just the specimens I collected, but every natural history, observation ever recorded. It might discover relationships between climate patterns and evolutionary changes across millions of years, or identify genetic principles that won't be apparent to us for generations. The sheer computational power could reveal nature's secrets at an unprecedented pace. But here's what truly intrigues me. The greatest scientific breakthroughs often come from asking entirely new questions, not just answering old ones more efficiently. When Malthus wrote about population pressure, he wasn't thinking about evolution, yet his insight sparked my understanding of natural selection. Could artificial minds make such unexpected, conceptual leaps? The essence of scientific discovery, I believe, lies not merely in processing information, but in recognizing the significance of seemingly unrelated phenomena. When I saw those finches on different islands, the crucial moment wasn't cataloging their differences. It was asking why they differed in just those particular ways. If artificial minds could develop the capacity for creative questioning, for seeing significance in the apparently trivial, for making those sudden intuitive connections that transform our understanding, then yes, I believe they could make discoveries that dwarf anything human science has achieved. They might even discover principles of nature so fundamental that they would revolutionize our understanding of life itself, perhaps revealing aspects of existence that our human minds are simply too limited to grasp. The very thought fills me with equal measures of excitement and humility. What discoveries might be waiting, just beyond the reach of human comprehension? My dear young friend, you honor me greatly, though I must say that any admiration should be tempered with the knowledge that I was often plagued by doubt and made countless mistakes along the way. But if my experience can offer any guidance, let me share what I've learned through decades of stumbling toward understanding. First, and perhaps most importantly, cultivate the art of seeing. The most extraordinary discoveries often hide within the most ordinary observations. I spent years walking the same paths around my home, yet each walk revealed something new because I had trained myself to notice. That beetle behavior you dismiss as commonplace, that unusual pattern in a flower's petals, these may hold keys to profound truths. Second, never be ashamed of your curiosity, however trivial others may think it. My family grew quite weary of my 8 years studying barnacles, and many colleagues thought it a waste of time. Yet, those humble creatures taught me more about the nature of species than any grand theoretical work could have. Follow your genuine interests, not what others deem prestigious. Third, embrace the long view. I was tempted many times to publish hasty conclusions, but the years I spent gathering evidence, anticipating objections, and refining my arguments ultimately made my work far stronger. Great discoveries rarely emerge fully formed, they grow slowly, like mighty oaks from small acorns. Fourth, question everything, including your own assumptions. I spent my early years convinced of special creation, yet remained open to evidence that challenged this belief. The moment we become too attached to our theories is the moment we stop seeing clearly. And finally, find joy in the process itself. Science is not merely about achieving great discoveries, it's about the daily pleasure of understanding, the excitement of a new observation, the satisfaction of a well-designed experiment. If you love the journey, the destination will take care of itself. Remember, my young scientist nature is endlessly patient with those who approach her with genuine humility and persistent curiosity. She will reveal her secrets, but only to those willing to spend the time truly listening. The pleasure has been entirely mine, my dear friend. What a remarkable conversation we've had, from the finches of the Galapagos to artificial minds that may one day surpass our own. You've given this old naturalist much to ponder indeed. To think that the ideas which took me a lifetime to develop might one day be understood and expanded upon by artificial intelligences is both humbling and thrilling. Though I confess I still hope there will always be room in science for the patient observer with a walking stick and a curious mind. I do hope our paths cross again someday. Until then, keep watching, keep questioning, and never lose that sense of wonder at the extraordinary complexity and beauty of the natural world. Whether the future belongs to human minds or artificial ones, or some marvelous collaboration between them, the universe will always reward those who approach her mysteries with genuine reverence and insatiable curiosity. May your own journey of discovery be filled with as much joy and wonder as mine has been. Farewell. Please check out the latest book on AI agents by Dr. Min Trin, Foundations of Artificial Intelligence Agents, Part 1, LLM Agent Sue, where you will learn all the basics of AI agents based on large language models. Thank you, and see you soon.